All right, let's get ready for some pretty heavy stuff today.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be talking early communist and socialist thought.
Yeah.
Specifically, we are diving deep into the Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
Right.
A text that is like the ultimate cheat sheet to understanding these ideologies.
Absolutely.
We've got excerpts published by the Socialist Labor Party back in 1891.
That's right. And we're going to break down those core arguments, give you a little bit of that historical lowdown, and pull out some truly fascinating details.
Oh, yeah.
That'll help you get why this text still matters.
Even today.
Even today.
I am already hooked
Yeah.
by that opening line.
Okay.
A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Talk about a dramatic entrance.
It grabs you, right?
Yeah.
But it also tells us that these ideas weren't just some academic theory.
Right.
They were seen as a direct threat to those in power.
So who exactly was feeling threatened?
Well, Marx and Engels call out a pretty diverse group.
Okay.
Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies.
Wow.
Basically, anyone who benefited from the existing power structure, whether political or religious, was on edge.
Okay, so this was shaking things up on a major scale. But what was at the heart of this specter of communism?
It all boils down, for Marx and Engels, to class struggle. They saw history as a constant back and forth between those who control resources and those who work for them.
And they didn't just pull that out of thin air, right?
Not at all.
They had examples.
Yeah, they use examples from ancient Rome with the patricians and plebeians battling it out to the feudal lords versus the serfs in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Their point is this tension is a recurring theme throughout history.
So how did this class struggle play out in their own time? Enter the bourgeoisie.
Exactly. They were the up-and-coming capitalists, the ones who dismantled feudalism and created the modern industrial world.
Right.
Marx and Engels actually give them credit for this revolutionary role, describing how they pitilessly torn asunder the old feudal ties, replacing them with a system based on naked self-interest and cash payment.
Wow.
Pretty intense.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
But they weren't exactly fans of this new bourgeois world either, right?
Not quite.
Okay.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
They argue that the bourgeoisie's own success will ultimately lead to its downfall.
Okay.
The very tools they use to create this new system, things like industrial progress and a focus on economic efficiency, will end up being used against them by a new class, the proletariat.
So wait, it's like they sowed the seeds of their own destruction. How does that even work?
It all comes down to the rise of modern industry.
Okay.
Factories need workers, and that's where the proletariat comes in.
Right.
Marx and Engels argue that as industry grows, so does the proletariat, forming a massive class of people who are dependent on selling their labor to survive.
Right.
And they don't paint a very pretty picture of factory work.
They don't, do they?
Not really.
Okay.
They describe how workers become almost like cogs in a machine, reduced to commodities that are bought and sold on the market.
Yeah.
They're alienated from their work, from the things they produce, and even from each other.
That's a bleak outlook.
It is.
So if the bourgeoisie created this huge disgruntled workforce, how did they think it would all end?
Well, Marx and Engels believed that the fall of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the proletariat were equally inevitable.
Okay.
They even use this striking phrase, the bourgeoisie is producing its own gravediggers.
That's a powerful image.
It is.
But how exactly were the workers supposed to become these gravediggers?
Yeah.
I mean, were they just supposed to wait around for the system to collapse?
That's where the idea of collective potential comes in.
Okay.
Remember how I said the proletariat is constantly growing in number? Well, Marx and Engels believed that their power lies in their ability to organize, to unite, and act as a collective force.
So it's not just about individual workers being unhappy.
Right.
It's about them recognizing
their shared interests.
Right.
And working together to change the system.
Exactly. And that brings us to the role of communists in all of this.
Yes.
Right? They weren't just theorists sitting back and observing, were they?
Definitely not. They saw themselves as part of the most advanced and resolute section within the working class. Not a separate party.
Okay.
But the folks pushing the movement forward, representing the interests of the whole proletariat.
And one of their big goals was abolishing private property.
Right.
But that's a pretty controversial idea, right?
It is.
Weren't they worried about people freaking out?
Oh, they knew it was a radical proposal. But they were careful to distinguish between abolishing all property and specifically targeting bourgeois property, which they defined as capital.
Right.
Means of production.
Okay.
It's not about taking away your toothbrush or your personal belongings.
Your, stuff.
Yeah, it's about challenging the system where a small group controls the resources that everyone needs to survive.
So how did they respond to the critics who said, hey, won't this just make people lazy and destroy individual freedom?
They addressed those arguments head on.
Okay.
They pointed out that for the vast majority of people under capitalism, individual property is already a myth.
Okay.
They're working for wages, struggling to make ends meet.
Right.
The only ones truly benefiting from private property are the bourgeoisie.
Ah, so they were flipping the script.
Yeah.
Saying that the system is already rigged against most people.
Exactly.
When it comes to property.
Yeah. They also argued that true freedom comes from having control over your own life and labor, not from clinging to a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many.
Okay, so they were making a bold case.
Oh, yeah.
For a major overhaul of the economic system.
For sure.
But what did they actually propose to put in its place?
Well, the manifesto outlines a 10-point program.
Okay.
And the central focus is on shifting control of the means of production. Instead of being owned by private individuals.
Right.
They'd be controlled by the state.
Okay.
But this state would be run by the proletariat.
Right, not the bourgeoisie.
Not the bourgeoisie.
So it's about a fundamental transfer of power. But what's the ultimate goal of all this? What kind of world were they trying to create?
Their vision was for a classless society. A world where the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all.
Okay.
They imagined a future where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential without being held back by economic inequality or exploitation.
It's a radical vision.
It is.
For sure. And it raises a ton of questions about what such a society would actually look like in practice.
Absolutely.
Right.
But to understand their vision more fully, we need to look at how they distinguish their ideas from other types of socialism that were floating around at the time.
Okay.
Because they weren't exactly fans of every socialist idea out there.
They weren't.
Not at all.
Okay.
They spent a good chunk of the manifesto critiquing what they called reactionary socialism.
Reactionary socialism.
Yeah. Which they broke down into two main flavors.
Okay.
Feudal socialism and petty bourgeois socialism.
Okay. Let's unpack those.
All right.
What was so reactionary about feudal socialism?
Well,
I mean, the name kind of speaks for itself, right?
Yeah. It's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
This type of socialism came from the aristocracy.
Right.
The folks who were losing their power and privilege as the bourgeoisie rose to prominence.
So they were basically trying to turn back the clock.
Exactly. They were clinging to the old ways. Yeah.
Lamenting the loss of their feudal dominance.
Right.
And they tried to position themselves as defenders of the working class.
Okay.
Which Marx and Engels found pretty ironic.
Yeah, weren't they the original exploiters?
Right.
With their serfs and all that?
Exactly.
It's like, come on, guys.
Right.
You're not fooling anyone.
And beyond the hypocrisy, Marx and Engels argued that the feudalists fundamentally misunderstood the historical forces at play.
Okay.
They failed to see that the bourgeoisie was a product of their own system, and that the rise of the proletariat was an inevitable consequence of industrialization.
So they were trying to fight a losing battle, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, petty bourgeois socialism is a bit more complicated.
Okay.
It came from the shopkeepers, artisans, and small business owners who were feeling the squeeze from both the expanding bourgeoisie and the growing proletariat.
So they were stuck in the middle.
Kind of like the forgotten middle child.
You got it.
Economic system.
And their proposed solutions were a mix of trying to restore the old ways or somehow cramping modern industry within the confines of outdated property relations.
So also not a viable path forward.
Not in the long run, no.
Okay.
They saw it as both reactionary and utopian, a longing for a past that couldn't be revived, and a vision of the future that didn't account for the realities of class struggle.
Okay, so that's reactionary socialism. Out of the picture.
Out of the picture.
What about this true socialism they talk about? Was that any better?
That's where things get even more interesting. We'll dive into that next.
Okay.
But first, I'm curious, what's standing out to you so far?
Honestly, it's that image of the bourgeoisie creating their own gravediggers.
Yeah.
It's such a stark reminder that the very forces that drive progress can also lead to unexpected consequences.
It really encapsulates Marx and Engels' view of historical materialism.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that economic forces and the relationships between different classes are the real drivers of change.
Yeah.
And sometimes those changes can completely upend the existing power structures.
Right.
But to understand how they saw that playing out, we need to take a closer look at how they contrasted their own ideas with other socialist thinkers of the time.
Let's do it. This deep dive is getting deeper by the minute.
All right. Let's dive into true socialism.
Okay.
A phenomenon Marx and Engels found particularly fascinating.
Okay.
And not in a good way.
Okay.
They saw it as this uniquely German twist on socialist thought.
Okay, what was so different about the German context?
Well,
why did they get their own special category?
Picture this.
Okay.
German intellectuals were devouring French socialist and communist writings.
Okay.
Remember, those French ideas came from real, on-the-ground struggles of the French working class against a powerful bourgeoisie.
Got it. The French were dealing with the realities of industrial capitalism head-on. But Germany was a different story.
Exactly. In Germany at the time, the bourgeoisie was still battling it out with the feudal aristocracy and the monarchy for dominance. It was a whole different stage of economic and political development.
So these German thinkers were taking ideas born out of the French experience?
Precisely.
Okay.
And trying to apply them to a totally different situation.
Okay.
And instead of embracing the revolutionary edge of those French ideas, they kind of soften them.
Okay.
They turn them into these abstract philosophical concepts about human nature and eternal truths.
Okay.
Stripping away the urgency for concrete action.
So instead of focusing on the practicalities of workers, organizing and challenging the power structure.
You got it.
Okay.
They were getting lost in these philosophical debates.
Right.
And Marx and Engels were highly critical of this approach. They saw it as defanging these radical ideas, making them palatable to the ruling class, and ultimately serving the interests of, you guessed it, the petty bourgeoisie.
Okay, so true socialism was anything but true.
It was a distraction, a way of avoiding the actual class struggles happening on the ground.
Yeah, and the irony is they ended up being used by the very powers they claim to oppose. Like those absolute governments and the aristocracy.
It's fascinating,
Totally.
How ideas can be twisted and manipulated to serve different agendas.
It's like those greenwashing campaign companies run today, trying to make themselves look eco-friendly when they're still polluting up a storm.
That's a great analogy. But Marx and Engels didn't stop there. They also took aim at another type of socialism they labeled conservative or bourgeois socialism.
That sounds like a contradiction in terms. How can you be a socialist and a defender of the bourgeoisie?
It might seem that way. But this reflects a section of the bourgeoisie that was becoming aware of social problems and wanted to address them, but without fundamentally changing the system that benefited them.
So they wanted to have their cake and eat it too.
Exactly. They were all about reforms that would make the system run a bit smoother. Perhaps improve the lives of workers to some extent, but without challenging the underlying relationship between capital and labor.
Kind of like putting a Band-Aid.
That's a great way to put it.
On a gaping wound?
Yeah.
It might stop the bleeding temporarily.
Yeah.
But it doesn't actually heal the injury.
And Marx and Engels saw this as a dangerous illusion. A way of pacifying the working class. And preventing real revolutionary change.
So they were arguing that any attempt to solve the problems of capitalism from within capitalism.
You can't fix a broken system with the tools that broke it.
Makes sense. So we've covered reactionary socialism, true socialism, and conservative socialism. Marx and Engels were pretty busy.
Yeah, they were busy guys.
Debunking all these other approaches. Where did their own ideas fit into this whole landscape?
They saw themselves as part of a different tradition altogether. They're called critical utopian socialism and communism.
And what made this approach different?
Well, for one, it emerged during an earlier, less developed stage of the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie.
Okay.
Think early 19th century thinkers like Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen.
Okay.
These guys recognized the problems of capitalism, the class antagonisms, the inequality, the need for a more just and equitable society.
But they didn't really have a clear plan for how to get there.
Right. The proletariat was still in its infancy, lacking the political and economic clout to enact real change. So these thinkers focused on crafting these elaborate blueprints for utopian societies. They hope to inspire change through peaceful means, through small-scale experiments, and appeals to people's better nature.
Well, more idealistic.
Exactly.
And less grounded in the nitty-gritty realities of power dynamics and class struggle.
And while Marx and Engels respected the contributions of these thinkers, they were critical of this utopianism. They believed that relying on appeals to morality and goodwill without a clear understanding of the historical forces driving social change wouldn't cut it.
So they saw critical utopian socialism as a stepping stone, but ultimately too limited.
That's a good summary.
To achieve the kind of radical transformation they believed was necessary.
To truly understand the potential for revolutionary change, they argued you need to move beyond utopian dreams and grapple with the messy, sometimes even violent realities of class struggle.
And that's where their own theory of historical materialism comes in.
Exactly.
Right, the idea that economic forces and class relations are the real drivers
that's a
for history.
From hoping for a better world, understanding the dynamics of power and how to seize it.
So less wishful thinking and more strategic action.
And that's a big part of what makes the Communist Manifesto such a powerful and enduring document. It's not just about dreaming of a better future. It's about understanding how to make it happen.
I'm starting to get why this text had such an impact. But let's get practical for a moment. How did Marx and Engels envision the actual process of revolution unfolding?
They argued that the first step was for the proletariat to seize political power, essentially winning the battle for democracy.
But wouldn't a communist revolution be opposed to democracy?
That's a common misconception. Marx and Engels saw the existing state as a tool of the bourgeoisie used to maintain their dominance. So the proletariat needed to seize control of this tool and use it to dismantle the bourgeois system from within.
So they were talking about using the existing structures to bring about their own demise.
Exactly.
Kind of like a judo move.
I like it.
Using your opponent's strength against them.
They believed that once the proletariat was in power, they would use their political supremacy to gradually wrest all capital from the bourgeoisie, centralizing control of the means of production in the hands of the state.
But they weren't naive enough to think this would be a smooth, peaceful process.
They acknowledged that it would require some despotic inroads on the rights of property and the existing conditions of production.
So they were prepared for a certain level of force and disruption.
They saw revolution as a messy, often violent process, but one that was ultimately necessary to break free from the shackles of the bourgeois system.
They even outlined specific measures they believed would be needed to bring about this transformation?
Things like the abolition of property in land, a progressive income tax, the abolition of inheritance rights, and a whole lot more.
Wow. Some of those are still considered pretty radical ideas even today. It makes you wonder what kind of world would have emerged if they had gotten everything they wanted.
They definitely aren't afraid to think big, and their vision for the end result of this revolutionary process was equally radical. They believed that once class distinctions had disappeared and all production was concentrated in the hands of the people, the state itself would wither away, losing its political character.
That's a mind bender.
It is.
Why would the state disappear in a communist society?
Because in their view, the state only exists to enforce the dominance of one class over another. In a classless society, there would be no need for a state in the traditional sense.
It's a pretty utopian vision. I'll grant you that.
It is. But it follows logically from their whole argument about class struggle.
Right, being the root of so many social problems.
It's important to remember, though, that they saw this as a long-term goal. Something that would only be achieved through a protracted struggle. And they recognized that the specific measures needed to bring about this transformation would vary from country to country, depending on the historical and economic conditions.
So they weren't trying to create a one-size-fits-all
Not at all.
blueprint for revolution.
They were providing a framework for understanding the dynamics of power and the potential for revolutionary change, urging people to adapt their strategies to their own specific circumstances.
So it's not a rigid dogma,
Exactly.
but a set of guiding principles
That's a great way to put it.
that can be applied in different ways depending on the context.
And that's one of the reasons why the Communist Manifesto continues to be such a powerful and relevant document. It provides a framework for understanding the world and a call to action that transcends national boundaries and historical periods.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future. And that collective action can bring about profound social transformation.
And that's a powerful message no matter your political persuasion.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the historical backdrop of the manifesto to its core arguments and how they stack up against other socialist thinkers. But we haven't even touched on some of the most controversial parts of their program.
Oh, no.
Like their stance on the family.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. The idea of abolishing the family is something that's been used to demonize communist ideology for a long time. But what did Marx and Engels really mean by that? Were they really advocating for some kind of dystopian future?
Were they?
Where children are raised by the state and love is outlawed?
That's what a lot of people assume. But let's dig into what they actually said and see if we can separate the myth from the reality. Okay, let's talk about this whole abolition of the family thing. It's one of those phrases that gets thrown around a lot, often, without any real understanding of what Marx and Engels were actually arguing for.
For sure.
So were they really advocating for some kind of world where parents are separated from their children and everyone lives in these old impersonal communes?
Not exactly. To understand their argument, we need to go back to their analysis of bourgeois society and the role of private property. Remember, they saw the family as a microcosm of the larger capitalist system.
So the same power dynamics and inequality that play out in the broader society are also present within the family structure.
Precisely. They argued that the traditional bourgeois family, with the husband as the breadwinner and the wife as the dependent homemaker, was based on capital and private gain, just like any other economic institution.
And that this structure served to reinforce the power of men over women?
That's right.
And to perpetuate the capitalist system as a whole.
They pointed to the way women were often treated as mere instruments of production within the family. Their labor exploited for the benefit of their husbands and the capitalist system.
So they were basically saying that the family, as it existed under capitalism, was another form of oppression.
And they believed that the only way to truly liberate women and create a more just and equitable society was to abolish the economic basis for this traditional family structure.
Which brings us back to the abolition of private property. They saw that as the key to transforming all social relationships, including those within the family.
They believed that in a communist society where the means of production were owned collectively, the economic need for the bourgeois family would simply disappear.
So what did they envision as a replacement? Did they have any concrete ideas?
Well, they didn't lay out a detailed blueprint. But they did hint at a vision of free and equal relationships between men and women. Based on mutual love and respect, rather than economic dependence or social convention.
So it's not about abolishing love or marriage or even child rearing.
It's about transforming those relationships, freeing them from the constraints of property and economic necessity.
Exactly. They believed that in a communist society, people would be free to form relationships.
Yes.
Based on genuine affection and shared values.
Right.
Not on who owns what or who holds the economic power.
Exactly.
And they also talked about the importance of social education, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that children should be raised collectively.
Yes.
Not just within the confines of the nuclear family.
This was another controversial idea that often gets misrepresented. They weren't talking about some kind of Orwellian nightmare where children are snatched from their parents and raised in state-run institutions.
It was more about expanding the circle of care.
Exactly.
And ensuring that all children have access to the resources and support they need.
Yeah, it's about creating a society where everyone is responsible for the well-being of all children, not just their own biological offspring.
And let's face it, even in our current system, many families rely on a network of caregivers.
Absolutely.
Grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends, daycare providers to help raise their kids.
That's true.
So it's not as radical a concept as it might seem at first glance.
And it's important to remember that Marx and Engels were writing at a time when children from working class families often had to work in factories or mines from a very young age with little or no access to education or health care. They saw collective child rearing as a way to ensure that all children, regardless of their family background, had the opportunity to develop their full potential.
Okay, so their ideas about family were definitely challenging just the norms of their time.
For sure.
And they still spark debate today.
Absolutely.
But it's important to understand them within the context of their broader critique of capitalism and their vision for a more just and equitable society.
Now, another controversial aspect of the manifesto is its call for the abolition of countries and nationality. This often gets spun as some kind of globalist conspiracy. But that seems like a pretty simplistic interpretation.
What were they really getting at?
Well, keep in mind, they were writing at a time when nationalism was on the rise, often used to justify colonialism and imperial expansion. They saw national borders and identities as tools, used to divide the working class and pit them against each other.
The old divide and conquer strategy.
Exactly. They believed that by creating a global working class united in its struggle against capitalism, these artificial divisions would eventually fade away. It's a vision of a world where solidarity transcends national boundaries.
So it's not about erasing all cultural differences. It's about recognizing our shared humanity. And working together to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Precisely.
Now, we spent a lot of time digging into the arguments and controversies of the Communist Manifesto. But it's important to remember this text was written over 150 years ago. The world has changed a lot since then.
A lot.
That's for sure. So how relevant is the manifesto to our world today?
It's a great question.
Are these ideas just relics of a bygone era? Or do they still have something to teach us?
And I think that's one that each individual has to grapple with for themselves. Some might argue that the manifesto is outdated, that the specific conditions of capitalism have evolved, and that the working class has experienced both victories and setbacks in its struggle for liberation.
So the world is more complex
Absolutely.
than it was in Marx and Engels' time.
But I think the core insights of the manifesto remain remarkably relevant.
Okay, like what specifically?
Well, for one, their analysis of class struggle as a driving force of history remains a powerful tool for understanding the persistence of social and economic inequality. Even if you don't buy into the whole communist revolution thing, it's hard to deny that the gap between the haves and the have-nots is still a major issue.
We're definitely seeing that play out in our own time.
We are.
With the rising cost of living, stagnant wages. And the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny elite.
And then there's their critique of capitalism, particularly its tendency towards exploitation and alienation. I think that continues to resonate with a lot of people, especially as we see things like the climate crisis, the gig economy, and the erosion of social safety nets.
It feels like a lot of folks are working longer hours for less pay.
Exactly.
Feeling disconnected from their work. And struggling just to make ends meet.
That sense of alienation, that feeling of being a cog in a machine
right.
that doesn't care about your well-being
Yeah.
is something that Marx and Engels identified way back in the 19th century.
And then there's their vision of a classless society,
right.
free from oppression and exploitation.
It's a powerful source of inspiration for those who are working to create a more just and equitable world.
Even if it seems like a far-off utopia.
Absolutely.
It's still a powerful force.
It's a reminder that another world is possible.
Right.
Even if the path to achieving it is complex and uncertain.
So the manifesto is not a blueprint for revolution.
Yeah.
But it's a text that can help us understand the challenges we face and inspire us.
It is a call to action.
To work for a better future.
An invitation to think critically about the world around us. And to engage in the ongoing struggle for social justice.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive,
I
want to leave our listener with a final thought to ponder.
All right.
The manifesto focuses primarily on the economic and political dimensions of class struggle. But what about the psychological and emotional dimensions?
That's an interesting angle.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
Well, how does living under capitalism shape our sense of self, our relationships with others, and our overall well-being? Does it foster a sense of competition, individualism, and consumerism? That ultimately undermines our happiness and fulfillment?
That's a deep question.
Yeah.
And it's not one that Marx and Engels fully explored.
But I think it's crucial for understanding the full impact of capitalism on our lives and for imagining alternative ways of being in the world that prioritize human flourishing over profit and accumulation.
I agree.
Right.
It's a challenge for us to think beyond the economic and political structures and consider the deeper psychological and emotional dimensions of social transformation. Because ultimately, the goal is not just to create a more equitable society, but also to cultivate a sense of shared humanity and well-being for all.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these questions and continue your own deep dive into the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure exploring these complex and challenging ideas with you.